Hello, bonjour, and oki to everyone, and welcome to Nonprofits at 2. I'm Karen Ball, President and CEO of CCVO. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the over 200 members of CCVO and guests from Calgary, Alberta, and Canada joining us for today's important conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the place where we at CCVO are fortunate to call home. We honor and acknowledge the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina and Nakota nations, and the Métis Nation, Region 3, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. As a settler and an ally, I am proud to call Mohkinstsis home. We are all treaty people. February is Black History Month, and I want to recognize the contribution to our nonprofit sector by Vernetta Anderson, who is the first Black person elected to Calgary City Council, the co-founder of Meals on Wheels, and dedicated her time and expertise as a volunteer on the boards of the United Way Calgary, Calgary Tourist and Convention Association, and the Calgary Centre for the Performing Arts, among others. Vernetta's passion and commitment are part of one of many stories showcasing the impact of and need for more Black voices and representation in Alberta's nonprofit sector. CCVO hopes to continue to provide a platform for necessary conversations about diversity and inclusion in the sector, and to do our own work to address and remove barriers to equity that are part of our organizational systems and processes. A sincere thank you to the supporters of Nonprofit at 2 who make these gatherings possible. Today's gathering is presented by ATB Financial and supported by the Muttart Foundation, PwC Canada, and Suncor Energy Foundation. I'd also like to recognize and thank our media partner, Post Media. Before I introduce our panel, a few points about today's gathering. During the panel discussion that takes place over the first half of this session, you'll be able to submit questions for the live question and answer portion in the second half. At the end of the event, you'll also have a chance to answer a few short questions about your experience today. We hope you'll take time to complete the short survey and share your thoughts with us so that we can ensure that Nonprofits at 2 remains relevant and responsive to your interests and needs. Let me introduce you to the truly incredible group of experts that have generously come together to share their wisdom and insight with you today. Starting with our moderator, Teresa Woo-Paw. Teresa founded and built 7 nonprofit organizations over a span of 40 years, including the ActionDignity and Calgary Chinese Community Service Associations, among others. She is the first Asian Canadian woman elected to the Calgary Board of Education, the Alberta Legislature, and Cabinet Minister in Alberta from 2008 to 2015. Teresa has worked as a private consultant providing diversity training program facilitation and instruction, including as anti-discrimination trainer for the United Way of Calgary. She is currently the chair of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, founder and chair of ACCT Foundation, ACT2 and Racism National Network, and Asian Heritage Foundation, as well as a board member of the Calgary Arts Foundation. She's been awarded received several awards, including the Chinese Canadian Legend 2016, the YWCA Women of Distinction Award, and the Immigrants of Distinction Award. Welcome, Teresa. Tyson Bankert. Tyson works as the anti-racism trainer and organizational capacity builder at CommunityWise Resource Center. His personal slogan is promote justice, edify others, and befriend the lonely. Tyson has been a committed member of the Anti-Racism Organizational Change Project, AROC, process since 2016 and is excited to further the process and build capacity for the newly created cooperative BLAC, Black Alliance Leadership Council, with the support of CommunityWise Resource Center. Welcome, Tyson. Tim Fox. Tim is a proud member of the Blackfoot Confederacy from the Kainai Blood Reserve. Tim is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy with the Calgary Foundation and facilitates Indigenous men's domestic violence groups at the Calgary Correctional Centre, is chair for the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal People in Canada, and is the proud father of a 9-year-old daughter. A small note that Tim will be joining us until 3 p.m. today. We're so happy to have you for the majority of our conversation. Welcome, Tim. Dr. Roselle Gonsalves. Roselle is the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at ATB Financial, where she heads up the strategic initiatives to weave equity and inclusion into all aspects of the organization's endeavors. Her work in the field of EDI is underpinned by 10+ years of working and teaching in the areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and within diverse sectors, including social services, consulting, and post-secondary. Roselle holds a master's degree from the University of Toronto in Sexual Diversity Studies and Religious Studies, and earned her PhD at the University of Calgary in the study of transnational immigration identity, Canadian multiculturalism, and intersectionality. Welcome, Roselle. And last but certainly not least, Patti. Patti is a veteran community and arts champion with an extensive track record of leadership and service in Calgary and beyond. She is the president and CEO of Calgary Arts Development, has just completed her full term on the board of the Calgary Foundation, serves as a board member with the Toronto-based Agora Foundation, publisher of The Philanthropist, and was a founding board member of the Asian Heritage Foundation, Southern Alberta. Patti has been awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal and was the 2013 Harry and Martha Cohen Award winner, recognizing her significant contribution to Calgary's theatre community. Welcome, Patti. If I could ask all the panelists to please turn on their cameras and join me up front. Sadly, we will not be joined today by Tyra Erskine, who has needed to step away to deal with a family health emergency. Thank you all for joining us. I am so looking forward to today's discussion. So let's get on with it. Over to you, Teresa.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Karen, for the introductions. And also, I would like to acknowledge CCVO's effort to bring us together. You bring together this very dynamic panel for this afternoon's conversation. I hope that I'm coming through okay, technology-wise. Okay. So I'm okay. Okay. So and thank you for reconnecting me with CCVO via two session on the topic of systemic racism and diversity. A very timely and topical subject given the heightened focus on the pervasive anti-Black racism, especially since last April, magnifying the Black Lives Matter movement, leading to affixing the spotlight on systemic racism. All these unfolding with the backdrop alongside the increased awareness on anti-Indigenous racism, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process and report and the subsequent work, our continued reckoning with Islamophobia and the renewed anti-Asian racism exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the increasing xenophobia. So Roselle and I will start this conversations dialogue by setting the context with a bit of background information and overview of key concepts. So I will first start with a bit of background information. Calgary is Canada's third most racially diverse city. Populations of Alberta's two largest cities are comprised of over 35% visible minorities and between 3 to 5% of Indigenous backgrounds. These demographical changes were recognized back in the 1980s, noticeably by the Government of Canada's Multiculturalism Act, a law that speaks to the promotion of inclusivity amongst Canada's social, cultural, economic, and political institutions, and removing any barriers, preventing full participation of Canadians of all origins in society, and promised to assist individuals in eliminating and overcoming discrimination. So multiculturalism is not an act that actually talk about song and dance anymore for a very long time. A visionary policy propelled social justice-minded Albertans to take actions to respond to the call for more equitable accessible, and inclusive organizations, institutions, and society for diverse citizenry, the children and youth in our schools, the sick and the workers in our health services, people in need of support from the social and voluntary sector, citizens of all backgrounds having access to civil services from municipalities, policing, and justice, as well as the creative sector. Calgary responded with the City of Calgary's Employment Equity Office opened in the 1980s. Well, most of these initiatives have not actually continued. So I'll be naming and providing a bit of background context for your information. So the Calgary Police Service's first cross-cultural training was in 1986, and I would happen to be there. Calgary Health Services barrier analysis completed in 1993. United Way's multicultural organizational change initiative started in early 1990. I think it was 1991. The Calgary Board of Education strategic plan in 1991 identified diversity in English as a second language as the system's #1 priority. And the 1990 Welcoming City policy presented but never implemented. 2000 Diversity Calgary Leadership Council initiative initiated by the City of Calgary, a 2-year I think a social experiment that we gain a lot of learnings from. So my intent here is to provide a high-level context. We don't have time to talk about this initiative today, but it helped to raise a related question for us to keep in mind as part of today's conversation on systemic racism. Why are our key systems and entities seem to be discovering the issue of systemic racism again, if the conversation and the many fine attempts background information, I will now turn the floor over to Roselle to provide an overview on some of the key concepts on today's conversation, and then she would provide some additional information in addition to definition on discrimination, systemic discrimination, racism, and systemic racism. So Roselle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and I think that you have offered such a fantastic springboard for thinking about the conversation of systemic racism with your highlight of the fact that we seem to reinvent the wheel every so often, and this social desire to continuously forget and re-remember is in fact a form of systemic racism, right? And it's a little bit of social gaslighting that, oh, we've just discovered that racism exists in 2020, when we, many of us have known for time that this has been part of many of our lived experiences and many of the works that we have been a part of for some of us for decades. And so, we need to recognize that this work, we stand on the shoulders of giants in doing this, and we need to continue to build it so that generations after us can stand on our shoulders without needing to continue to forget that this work has been done. So thank you very much for having me be a part of this panel. I'm proud to be here as a voice representing ATB Financial. I lead up the diversity, inclusion, and belonging portfolio there. But diversity, inclusion, and belonging didn't come to me, Patti, something that I've had as a lived experience. I am an immigrant woman. I'm a queer woman. I have lived on this land and negotiated really deeply what that means about being an uninvited guest on Indigenous land. And I think that all of these conversations have to move in tandem with one another. They cannot be siloed conversations that happen in isolation. So with that, I will jump right into, Teresa, you had mentioned to me, let's offer some type of level setting, because we're talking about some terms that are pretty specific, and they can often come across as jargony, very specific to the world of folks doing inclusion work. And so, where I wanted to start was right at the bare bones, right? We often hear the language of bias, or, the very fashionable thing to do right now is to have unconscious bias training. As if to say, we'll have that unconscious bias training, we'll check that box, and then boom, all our biases are gone. And so I want to start there because, to have a brain as a human being is to be biased. That's just the mechanism that we're working with. It is a limited apparatus that is taking in more information than it has been built to take in. So bias, by its very nature, is just a function of us being human. It is an immediate pre-reason adjudication without reason for or against one thing or another. There's not a good or a bad or a morality attached to the actual concept or the brain mechanism of bias. Where we start getting into where bias starts becoming really problematic and starts to have these really systemic ripple effects is when bias is employed in prejudiced ways. So psychologically speaking, we are built in our brains to create in-group versus out-group bias. And what that means, what my first year undergrad psychology prof explained this to me as, was in-group bias is that everybody who is within my group is good and I can trust them, but we're all cool, different, diverse, and we all have our own interests, but I can trust all of us. Everybody who's in my out group, so outside of my little trusted circle, that's out-group bias. They are all the same, so they're homogenous, right? And quote unquote, those people, right? So outside of my group, and they are all the same, and I cannot trust them because of that. So this in-group versus out-group bias is where prejudice is rooted, right? It is that unjustifiable negative bias towards a group of people that in some way, shape, or form is different from my in-group that I belong to and hold really near and dear to my heart. We move from that idea of prejudice into action. So thus far, bias is in the brain, prejudice is in the brain. We move now into action. So discrimination, we start to talk about how do we then put prejudice and bias into action. It means that we start to behave in ways that action our prejudices, and that is called discrimination. So discrimination is that inappropriate treatment, that unfair treatment, that inequitable treatment of groups or people who belong to groups that are outside of the ones that I hold near and dear to my heart. Right? And so this might lead to those behaviors that we have all started to become really aware of, especially in our general parlance. It's become part of our conversation to talk about things like microaggressions. It's become part of our regular conversations to talk about things like bias in hiring processes, right? But that's where those prejudices start to show up. But thus far, I haven't talked about anything to do with racism, because we're here to talk about systemic racism. So once we unpack these three layers of human behavior, we come to those big systems, those isms, right? The racism, the sexism, the heterosexism, the homophobia, the transphobia, the xenophobia that you mentioned, Teresa. So racism is a system by itself, and it's a system of power. And within a power structure where certain groups of people are valued as more superior than other groups of people, that discrimination, that prejudice, that bias is employed on a power structure. And so what that means is that you can discriminate against anybody based on their race. However, not everybody experiences racism. So what I mean by that is that you can be prejudiced towards a white or white presenting person, and you can be discriminatory in your actions towards a white or white presenting person. However, in our society, particularly in our modern Western society, as it is shaped, white and white presenting humans experience a level of social power as opposed to Black, Indigenous, and otherwise racialized humans. So there's a power imbalance there. So even though a white person might experience discrimination, they're not experiencing racism, because racism is a structure by which you have to have both of those things in place. One, discrimination, and two, a power imbalance within society, right? And so this conversation of racism has to exist on the continuum of the conversation of power. And that's why we cannot have reverse racism. That's not a thing, right? And so just table stakes, that's where we're starting from. We can start talking about prejudice. We can start talking about ways in which we behave, certainly. But if we're going to talk about systemic structures, we have to recognize that societal power plays a huge role in how we construct who is the quote unquote majority, right? Even the term person of color, right? What does that imply? The fact that there are some people who don't have a color, right? And so that is a term that has real problems in unpacking it, because it is rooted with recognizing that whiteness is at the center, it is the neutral, and then all of the rest of us are outside, we are other, right? So we've moved some of our languaging to recognizing that racialized starts to build a recognition within our language, because words make worlds. This idea that we are not inherently other, we have been made other. And I give this personal example. I was born in India in a community where I was not racialized, right? Everybody around me looked, sounded, felt, thought, whatever, the same as I did. And it felt like I was part of the homogenous whole. It was in my immigrant experience that I all of a sudden had to reconceive of my skin color as somehow different than in a power continuum to other bodies. And so this is a really important thing to keep in mind. Racialization is actually a process that is put upon bodies. It is not something that is inherently existent. So that's, you know, the broad concepts of racism and power. I also want to touch on a little bit on the concepts of when we're talking about anti-racism, it's really important for us to keep in mind that one of the pillars of anti-racism is intersectionality. And intersectionality was given its name in the late 80s and early 90s by a Black woman, a lawyer, a scholar. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. She is one of the architects of modern intersectionality and the thought processes behind it. Intersectionality is a lens that recognizes that we live at the intersections of multiple power structures and multiple identities, right? And so I cannot separate out the fact that I am racialized from the fact that I'm a woman. And I experience both of those identities simultaneously and in conversation with the systems of racism as well as sexism, right? So intersectionality really takes into consideration the intersections, not just of identities and where they intersect, but also with the power structures that then become compounded in order to affect my experience of walking through the world in this particular body. And so intersectionality is a really important lens for us to employ when we consider unpacking racism within our nonprofit sector, particularly because our nonprofit sectors are often led by women, particularly because our nonprofit sectors are often serving equity-seeking communities where intersectionality is at the heart and center of the work that needs to be done in order for the services that are offered to be truly representative of the communities that we are serving. So those are, you know, a couple of the things that I wanted to touch upon to open up today's conversation. I'm happy to jump in. I know that there's a wealth of knowledge and experience on this panel to really showcase the impacts and what we can do to start exploring outside the bounds of racism within our sectors. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Teresa. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to jump in wherever throughout this panel.
Well, thank you very much, Roselle, for providing that conceptual background information for us so that we can actually all operate with at least some common understanding on key concepts, linking the relationship between implicit bias, microaggression to, you know, acting on the prejudice which constitute discrimination when that is combined with social power that constitute racism, and also touch on the concept of whiteness and intersectionality. So thank you very much for that background piece, Roselle. And at this point, I would like to start our conversation with our panelists. I would like to start with Tim Fox, and who have been introduced by Karen earlier. So I would like to invite Tim to start our conversation this afternoon by having you describe for us how systemic racism is manifested, operationalized in the nonprofit sector, and in particular, its impact from an Indigenous perspective. Kim?
Awesome. Thanks, Teresa and Roselle, for that context setting. Yeah, just another expression of gratitude to CCVO for having me be a part of this incredible panel. I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself a lifelong learner in this space, and can always happy to continue to grow. I always like to reflect on this deep-rooted unconscious bias, this thought pattern that exists about the Indigenous community that is so deeply ingrained in the fabric of society that it comes out in very harmful and problematic ways. Definitely way back when, and we learn about leaders in our Canadian history like John A. Macdonald and Duncan Campbell Scott, who were recognized as Canada's first Prime Minister and a bureaucrat in charge of Canada's Indian policy, who stood before Canadian citizens and referred to the Indigenous community as barbaric, uncivilized, a problem, who needed to be gotten rid of. So this is like way back in Confederation days. That thought pattern still exists today about the Indigenous community. Many of our white settler, white representatives, participants on this call might have been raised with this negative thought pattern. And the way it exists within the systems is by the treatment that Indigenous people receive when accessing human services, specifically Indigenous women, and specifically Indigenous people of queer and transgender backgrounds. There's a statistic it's an older statistics from 2006 that talks about the growing population of the Indigenous community, that it's the fastest growing segment of the population. And while that's an old statistic, that trend is still the same, that it's a very young Indigenous population that is growing. And it's the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population. So that should tell us a couple of things. It should tell us that the not-for-profit sector, many sectors have to prepare themselves for this growth. And I'll be touching a little bit on the work and the approach that the Calgary Foundation is taking in that regard. But, you know, I can draw upon many examples. One that comes to mind is Joyce Eschwakon, who was, you know, lost her life in a very public way just recently while seeking medical attention. And instead of being provided with, you know, care and concern, there was nurses in the background of this video clearly discriminating against her as an Indigenous woman. There are other examples that are manifesting, more recent examples that of Indigenous people leaving the sector, leaving their organizations just because of these deep-rooted unconscious bias and thoughts and patterns that exist within the fabric of our organizations. It's very damaging, it's harmful. You know, I feel like to a certain degree, the not-for-profit sector is meant to help and support and lift people up when there's still this deep-rooted thought pattern that exists within, you know, I feel like I'm being repetitive here, but it comes back down to, like I said, these strong white leaders. There's an element of dominant culture. So Roselle, you talked about this a little bit, and I'm not really convinced that a lot of people in the sector are really aware of bias and how it unconsciously prevails in hiring practices and how they support and outreach to community. So I appreciate your sort of definitions of that. I'm just not sure that many people in the sector realize how harmful it still manifests through our workplaces, through the very intention. We're very aware of deficit statistics when it comes to the Indigenous community. Sometimes for not-for-profits, those deficit statistics drive their action and their programming or their strategic plans, which isn't a bad thing to do, but I'm more about what are you doing to really understand where those deficit statistics come from in the first place. Are you reconciling with the legacies of how your infrastructure and your organizations were built, sometimes off of power and privilege? Until you sort of really sit in with that complexity, begin to unpack it, and then begin to engage Indigenous voices, women, and people from the QT communities, and really listen to them instead of combating them with your opinions and all that kind of stuff, will we see real significant change. I try to sort of inspire folks to understand, yeah, there's socio and economic challenges for the Indigenous community, for sure. But look at those socio and economic challenges through the lens of history and social injustice. Once you begin to do that, then you could sort of lower the levels of this organizational iceberg that you have right now. We're very surface level. There's a mental model that exists about all of our organizations. It's positive, we're helping professions, we're doing all of this good stuff. But once you begin to lower that waterline, you begin to identify the problematic areas, but also the leverage points of focus that you can take those next steps, because people often grapple with, well, what do I do? In this day and age, like you presented earlier, this work has been going on for decades. I think we're at a point where we want to see some of this awareness and understanding mobilize. I talk about it in the form of knowledge extraction versus knowledge mobilization. From an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous communities have been extracted from, right from contact, extracted from land, extracted from natural resources, extracted from children. It's just take. In this contemporary time, it's showing up as knowledge extraction. And we're at a point where organizations, the not-for-profit sector and other sectors, need to find ways to mobilize that knowledge. If you are attending sessions like this merely for the goal and the outcome to increase your understanding, you're being no less extractive than settler ancestors before you. It's what are you going to do after sessions like this? What are the conversations you're going to have with senior leaderships? Maybe identify some of those people you have lost recently along the way who have been pushing and striving and fighting for change, but have been ultimately been pushed out of your organization because of this dominant narrative culture that exists. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you, Tim. Okay, let's make sure. Okay, so thank you, Tim. Thank you for, I think laying out the important connections between thought patterns, the bias, the implicit bias, and to actually the harm that it causes to people who are in need of support, who should have equitable access to opportunities within our different organizations and systems. And it's very important as discrimination is defined by impact, by the harm, and not by intent. So thank you for, I think, that making that explicit to us, and how it impacts people's opportunity in terms of through our hiring process, in the human resource practices, in terms of actually understanding the people we're supposed to serve. When you talk about, understanding the communities, making connection to those communities. So thank you for laying that out for us. And I'm sure that we'll build on some of those very important foundational points. So at this point, then I'm going to invite Tyson to join us and talk about from your perspective the impact of systemic racism to from a Black Canadian's perspective, how it is manifested, operationalized in the nonprofit sector. And from either a personal perspective, experience, or from a community, perspective. Tyson.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Tyson Bankert. I go by he/him pronouns. I cannot speak for all Black people in the Black community. I have a very, I think, unique experience. But what I can say and speak to is my own experience, and what I think some of the stories and impact that I've been learning from fellow members in AROC, which is Anti-Racist Organizational Change project that is being done at CommunityWise. And I think I guess two things I wanted to actually highlight is one is when I read the word impact, very much, Teresa, what you said is around there's this behind the scenes, there's this intention. And I've worked in a few various nonprofits here in Calgary, and specifically there's an intention, a good intention at best, to reduce some of these systemic barriers that have been set up. And I think as we start to get to really dig into this work, and I've worked with different various nonprofits where it has become, well, what now? What next? I feel like I'm trained, or I feel like we are at a space where where our intentions now can maybe match our better impact, our improving our impact. And but what starts to happen is it does become much more complex and complicated. And I actually want to talk about that a little bit later on as to what we saw through the AROC process. But I think one of the impacts that happens is, and I continue to see this frequently, is when it comes to even diverse applicants, for example. We are looking for diverse applicants, we're looking for it with lived experiences, and that's often, I believe, can with even with the right intentions and not understanding how the impact actually is, can cause lots of harm to the diverse applicant who now thinks that oh well, this position is really welcoming to someone like myself. And I think that really goes back into Roselle's great setting a tone around how, you know, we talk about systems and impacts that our current system and the way that it is set up is for those who do benefit from it, and by that by benefiting it is really that understanding of it, the cultural values, the way that the laws are understood, the rules are, and also who benefits from that. And so I think the openness to someone who does walk into a position that is for a diverse applicant, let's say, who is also a person of color, they can't speak for everyone in that group that they are asked to hold all of that space for. And oftentimes the work that I've seen and have experienced is then actually all downloaded and burdened to then speak to the diverse clientele that nonprofit is supporting. And so to really break that down for you folks, I guess just is well, there's a group of, we know that there's a select group of Black people who are in our clientele that we want me as the only maybe sole Black employee to go and support. And my experience has a lot of privilege within that. And so the question then is then how am I supposed to support and help them without maybe now the power specifically within my organization to maybe do that, to do the things that I feel and understand need to be done. And there's this really interesting process, and I'll share it actually with folks at CCVO to send out, but it's called the Problem Woman of Color as an example of how a process of burnout happens in an organization where you, as maybe the only person of color, or maybe, you know, I've even been told in that, oh, now we have two of them. that doesn't actually support the systemic change that actually needs to be done, because we know that two people can't begin to create the impact that the nice intention is looking for. it becomes a very a vicious circle, I believe, as it relates to one of the ways that I think even when we say diverse applicants, this good intention has and impacts a person of color in this position. And it comes back to, I think, also even a larger barrier too, as well as is having to still conform to the culture of whiteness, I believe, as it relates to how that organization functions. So I have seen in some organizations where, well, if you just did this, or if you just sounded like this, or if you had done it this way, because we are educated in this way to do these things, come into conflict with the norms and the power that is held in an organization. And so I do find that is it becomes a lot more nuanced and a lot more problematic, I believe, as you start to dig deeper into, well, what's next, and to be able to hold space honestly for that, I think, is one of the ways that an organization and actually leadership in those positions in a nonprofit can begin to break apart what that means for not only for staff, but also the clients that they serve, and also be able to have impact, I think, from a funding perspective, from building a community of care around accountability as well. So that's I'm trying to reduce my as much time as I'm at my limit here according to my clock. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tyson, for really help to articulate the impact of discrimination, because discrimination, systemic racism impact different people differently, right? So as you have pointed out, there are people who actually benefit from the discrimination, by actually having their own value system validated, their norms and belief actually upheld as the acceptable values and norms and beliefs. Actually, they have the privilege, the dominant group have the privilege to opportunities and also services. And be it oftentimes those privilege are not actually conscious to those who benefit from them. On the other side, the impact on the disadvantaged is, like you said, inequitable access to opportunities such as job, and inequitable access to services, to funding, and burnout, the extra burden of being that, that minority in the system, and with no power, but the responsibility to help fix some of the problems. And so also the added burden having to conform, and which sometimes may lead to actually a sense of inferiority and also internalizing the racism. So thank you so very much for, I think, outlining that the differential impact of discrimination on our organizations and system. So with that, then I'm going to go back to Tim, because Tim actually have to leave us a little early. So so I would like to maybe spend the next few minutes or so to have you share your insights, some of your key learnings from the work that you have been doing and leading as Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy at the Calgary Foundation. Yeah, I think I'll just turn it over to you for the next 3 to 5 minutes or so. Take it away.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, sorry that I do have to take off a little bit early. I guess when I was welcomed into this work back in 2017 of June, I was tasked with the mandate to facilitate a change process for the Calgary Foundation and try to find ways to mobilize the work of reconciliation. Now, when I started this work, I definitely had ideas in the back of my mind on things that we can begin to implement when it comes to granting, when it comes to outreach to Indigenous-led charities and First Nations communities, it just didn't sit well with me to come in and begin to implement all of these changes without taking the stakeholders, all of the actors, the staff, the board, the volunteers, through deep levels of contextual understanding. I needed them because I fervently believe all systems need to change. Every single system has to change. One of the crucial ways to change those systems is when you shift attitudes and beliefs. So had I come in to the Calgary Foundation and said, you know what, we're going to do oral applications. We are going to make this a part of staff performance development evaluations. We're going to be more intentional around impact investing. We're going to do this, yada, 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 without taking the time to unpack and surface this deep-rooted context behind why all of this change has to happen. It would have just perpetuated confusion. It would have perpetuated some of these myths that exist for Indigenous people. So our approach has been a systems change approach. We have started with new areas of knowledge creation. I feel like the infrastructure of why we exist as Calgary Foundation has been built off a particular culture, has been built off of a particular knowledge system that prioritizes the dominant culture. There's lots of characteristics of white supremacy that we are unpacking. And so we are taking the time to do a lot of design work. And that design work is working towards more progressive transformation. I feel like in the past and historically, organizations have taken on design work, but the moment it gets into an uncomfortable conversation, it stops the work from happening because people feel uncomfortable. We're moving through that. We're facing some challenges along the way, but for the past 4 years that I've been doing this work, the context setting of new knowledge creation and the connections to impacts of intergenerational trauma, historically, residential school survivors, the constant loss of children, young people to suicide, the current epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we are creating strong connections to why that matters today and to why these communities, the Indigenous community, is still experiencing barriers and barriers to access the opportunities of wealth that the Calgary Foundation has built since 1955. So I feel like organizations need to, part of it is to create these strong knowledge systems, these new knowledge systems, these new ways of knowing, being, and doing. And then if you're sitting there as a leader of your organization and you're sort of in the back of your mind thinking, oh yeah, we've done that awareness training, we've done this workshop, we've done yada, yada, yada. That's great. As an individual person, your individual knowledge capacity has probably increased. But I'll ask you this question. Can you, without a doubt, 100% say that every single person that is working within the institution, the organization that you're with, has that same level of understanding? Every single person, every single stakeholder. And if the answer is no, then that's what's next. You have to sort of embed that new knowledge system within the fabric of these organizations. With that, ideas will emerge around solutions and how to enforce levels of reciprocity and reparation. I agree with you. This work has been going on for decades. From an Indigenous perspective, I'm trying to articulate to the sector that, guys, this is generational work. It's not like in 1 year's time or 5 years, we're going to be like, oh, great job, we're reconciled. That's not going to happen. You have to invest in this work and in the people by creating a strong foundation of understanding and then mobilize that understanding. So that's the approach we're taking here at the foundation. At the same time, we're trying to support the broader community. We've worked with many of the charitable partners. Some of them might be on the call today. Definitely CommunityWise, Cada as well. So we're trying to bring these other entities, these partners who have a vested interest along with us at certain points as well.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for sharing your work with us from another perspective. I think with your lead, the organization is benefiting from actually really deepening that understanding, that knowledge piece, really unpacking, examining. I think you used the iceberg analogy earlier. The drivers behind what have been perpetuating all these barriers, the policies, the practices, the norms. Really requires examination, deep examination, honest examination before people can actually take that proper, the action that will lead to sustainable change. And also for reinforcing the point that this is this work requires commitment, long-term investment, long-term commitment. Even though it's generational, we have to start now, and we have to understand that we owe it to our children. The children, the vulnerable children who are committed suicide, vulnerable women who are not getting services when they experience domestic abuse. People lose their lives, and the children lose trust in our system when we do not actually sustain this work. So thank you for bringing that out for us today. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon. So now that we've had the opportunity to gain some insight on the impact of systemic racism for members of the Indigenous and Black communities, next we'll look at addressing systemic exclusion from an organizational perspective through the journey of the Calgary arts development. Now I turn to another panelist, Patti, CEO of Cada, champion of the arts sector, someone I have attended quite a number of cultural events with the past few years. And so Patti, shall we start, with the beginning? Tell us about the impetus for the Cada institutional change process from an organizational perspective, and perhaps also from a personal perspective, if you'd like.
Sure. Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you all for attending today and taking part in this conversation. When you see me looking this way, it's because that's where my notes are, or down here, it's because that's where my writing is. So first off, I would just like to wish everybody Gong Hei Fai Choi Son Yin Fai Lok. In my community, it is the Lunar New Year, which is a very, very special time. It is a time of new beginnings. So in a year of pandemic, the fact that I get a do-over is a good thing. So all the good luck and good fortune on you all as we undertake this year of the ox. The other thing I want to share is whenever I have the honor of being invited to these conversations, I always make a point of reflecting and referring to the land acknowledgement that we received. As Tim said earlier, this is all part of a journey. It's not a checklist, and for all 172 of you on the call, know that your commitment to this is a commitment to the long game. As Tim said, as Tyson said, and know that somebody who is a funder is saying that to you. And there will be more funders who say that to you going forward. So, in this little bit of time, I'll talk a bit about where I'm coming from and then a bit about our experience. But here on Mohinstis, right, when we talk about that systems change, when Tim talked about Sir John A. Macdonald wanting to take the Indian out of the child, that's in the 19th century. And we are living in systems that are perpetuated by a Prime Minister of Canada saying, barbarians, they're barbarians. We're going to take the Indian out of the child. And something I heard today, which I thought was awesome, is trickle down might not work in economics. One can argue. I don't believe it does. It sure does in racism and bias. So think about that. Think about how in the 19th century, the very systems we work in right now are fostered by that. And furthermore, they are reinforced when leaders in the current day talk about Kung Flu, or that election was fixed, and 75 million people agree. So for any of you who might think, oh, the system's done better, I invite you to think about that for a little bit, and think about that bias that Roselle talked about earlier is very much here. It's very much present. This is a real thing. We're not talking about something that my ancestors or 2 generations ago, and why am I having to pay for that? Why you are having to atone, why you are having to reconcile, is because you are the leader in this community right now. You are the one who has the influence, who has the power. So you can either choose to say, we're going to take the Indian out of the child, or you can choose to say, we are all here for each other, and we will all take care of each other. So that's the kind of context I come into this conversation with. As I said, Calgary Arts Development, by and large, we are a funder in the arts, primarily arts and cultural activity. I talk about being a public agency, stewarding public dollars in the interests of the public good, public benefit. So, you know, most of the budget I receive from all of the tax dollars. I don't get them just from I talk about women over 50 in the Southwest. So, of course, I would work towards anti-racism. Of course, our organization would be on a path of reconciliation, a journey of reconciliation. And of course, the clients, the organizations, the individuals we work with, we're going to call upon you to think about it in that way too, if you're going to receive the public dollars, which, by the way, as a taxpayer, when I pay my taxes, they no longer become my dollars, they become our dollars. And so when they become our dollars, that's where the public good, that's where the public benefit. And for all of you in the not-for-profit or charitable sector, your social missions are not about the mission as it serves you, it's about the mission as it serves others. And so that's a really important thing. That was something that I thought a lot about in our work here, which actually started in 2017 in a really robust way. I came on as the CEO in 2013. You know, as Teresa said, we come from a long history of individuals whose shoulders we stand on, right? And you know, and sometimes those shoulders are big and broad and tall, and sometimes they sink back a bit, right? And so that, again, the journey, this is a long game. And so not a checklist. So as I'm just sharing these last few minutes with you, you know, think about what your commitment is to the work. Think about where your power lies. How might you use it differently? Those are the things that we thought about as a leadership team, and then as an organization broadly, including our board. We brought on an inclusive designer in residence. Their name is JD Derbyshire in 2017. And JD started right at the beginning with us, right? You know, diversity is variety. Inclusion is about belonging. Equity is about removing barriers. Accessibility is about, from the beginning, you plan to allow access for full participation. Really simple. We didn't need to find white papers, which may be a racist term in and of itself now that I say that. I don't know. But anyway, we didn't need to rely on big, long definitions. We thought about diversity as an outcome. Same with inclusion, so that it didn't become a checklist item for us. And so, so with that in mind, we started to think about the various pieces, and also I'd invite you, as you're in this work, find those things that stick to you. You know the analogy of throwing spaghetti against the wall and which of the noodles stick, right? Like, invite yourself, be curious about all different kinds of learning, all different kinds of ways to experience or to learn about these different ideas and definitions, and something's going to stick. And so for me, Verna May, she's a sociologist, anthropologist, I think, but she came up with a saying that said, Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And then a very good friend to us in our community, Cesar Cala, added, and equity is choosing the band. So that really stuck with me. And it was really the beginning of how we started our work. And so from 2017, learning these definitions, starting to do our own personal journey, our own personal exploration of systemic racism, as well as an organizational one. And that is now an expectation we have of every member of our staff. It's part of your accountability agreement to have an organizational goal as well as a personal EDIA goal. So it's part of your performance review. But in addition, and I'll just go kind of through my checklist because I'm at the end of my time here. This learning for us, this centering our EDIA work in curiosity has resulted in us making applicant accommodations for equity. So, you know, you heard Tim talk about oral applications. We offer translation. We offer childcare if you want to come make your application in person. We try to accommodate and allow for that accessibility. White members of our staff had a book club surrounded around the workbook Me and White Supremacy. People of color in our office have met together as people of color to talk about anti-racism on a somewhat regular basis. The pandemic kind of put a whammy in that. We've created gatherings for artists whose work involves social change and social justice called the Cultural Instigators. We create the space, but we don't lead it. It's up to those artists and those cultural instigators to take part. We have a Black Lives Matter statement on our website. We were actually called out for it for taking so long. And so that's where I would say humility. Don't be afraid to try things. And if they don't work, then admit it. Don't be afraid to say, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Humility will take you a long way. Perfection will be your downfall. So that'd be something I tell you. We're working on an equity statement. And so back to our Black Lives Matter statement, we've been working on this equity statement coming on 2 years. And I would say that part of that was 2 years ago, me being worried about perfection. I wanted to come out and have it say everything. And here we are 2 years later. So that's the consequence. We're working on that. We have a citizen artist YYC group. EDIA is a board agenda item on every board meeting agenda quarterly. Our board recruitment now has an EDIA lens on our matrix. We're now looking at shared learnings. We always want to have these conversations with others in the community. And we have podcasts. We did an anti-racism town hall series this summer. We'll do it again this year so that we can keep the conversation going. And then the final thing that I'll just say here is again, immerse yourself in this. It's hard work sometimes, but that's also part of the journey, is the discomfort. I'll end it there because I've gone over. Thank you.
Oh, no, this is wonderful. Thank you so very much, Patti, for answering all three of my questions. And so I just like to summarize by saying that I think you have illustrated some really important points in addressing systemic change. Having a champion at the executive level, and both for you and for your organization, that you have actually you are doing this work because of the moral case as well as the business case. And so I think those are very important drivers to sustain the work. And so I'm not going to summarize all the good work that's been happening at Cada. You know, I think you talk about you know, practice change, service change, actually human resource change, and community relations. That's why we go to all those activities together. So I think that you spoke to, I think, the comprehensive change that have to happen so that this change work is happening in a consistent, comprehensive, congruent way, so that would help to actually institutionalize and sustain the change in efforts that you and others have been actually leading in the change in Cada. Now, I want to also say that I have never learned of an organizational change process delivered in such a fun and dynamic way. You make it look so easy. You're making this work actually more easily understood by people, and you make it seem like this is good work, but it's not extra work. And so, you know, I also, you know, as a learner on this work and in this journey, I have to say that's the fun thing about associated with the arts. But anyways, I think with that, I'm going to actually spend the next maybe 5 to 7 minutes or so to open up to all of the panelists to respond to any of the following points. I think that many people have touched on, especially with the example of Cada, some of the key factors to successful or promising systemic change, right? So, so I would like to pose this question on what would you identify as some of the barriers and challenges to organizational systemic change?
Oof, if that isn't like the $1 million question, Teresa. You know, I think one of the primary barriers, and I think both Tyson or Tyson, Patti, and Tim before he left touched upon the theme of this barrier. And I think that is the over-responsibilization of equity-seeking communities to dismantle the systems under which they experience marginalization. So what I mean by that is I have worked with, around, and alongside not-for-profit, nonprofit, charitable, public sector organizations for many, many years. And one thing that I've seen that really exemplifies what I'm talking about here is, you know, the organization will say, okay, we have a concern, we really need to put in place an Indigenous strategy, or we really need to put in place an anti-racism strategy. And then it'll look around its membership or its employee group, and it'll say, okay, you 3 Black, Indigenous, and racialized humans, you're going to be on this committee and figure it out, right? Without providing it with the resources, both financial, energetic, personnel, in order to drive those strategic initiatives forward. I think that that is a really important barrier to notice, because I think when we talk about systemic anti-racism or systemic racism, one of the things that we have internalized is that it's not our problem to solve. It's those other people who know about its problems to solve. And when we're living within power structures, I think, you know, folks spoke about when systems benefit us, it's hard for us to want to dismantle them. And it's hard for us to say, I'm going to sit on this anti-racism committee, knowing that, say, perhaps as a white person, I'm going to have to dismantle my own investment in the power that whiteness affords me. I'm going to have to talk about dismantling those systems actively, right? And so I see that as a really fundamental primary barrier. You know, I mentioned the limited capacity of our brains. We don't know the difference between fear that is rooted in discomfort and fear that is rooted in unsafety. And so when we're uncomfortable with the topic, like we don't want to talk about racism, we're really socially uncomfortable, we code it as, I'm really unsafe talking about this. And we have not exercised that muscle to recognize that we are safe. We might be uncomfortable, and to Patti's point, lean into that discomfort, right? The other thing that I notice in my work across the board doing EDI work, you know, it's funny that Tim mentioned, and Patti, you mentioned it too, take the Indian out of the child, right? I come from India, where also colonization happened, hence I have this fantastic Portuguese last name. But there was a British officer named Macaulay, and he'd written this paper about India and my kind of Indians. And he'd said, you know, we want to create a class of Indians, or a race of Indians who are Indian by skin and blood, but British by every other metric of identity. So removing every piece of their Indianness from them, right? It's almost like the colonial enterprise had a really specific agenda across the globe. That has not gone away. Do you know what the codified version of remove the Indian from the child and Indian by blood and color alone is today? It's, we're looking for fit in our groups. You don't fit, right? It's the same reason why Black women are primarily codified as angry when the same behaviors in a white man are codified as confident and outgoing and leadership qualities, right? We have taken the language of take the Indian out of the child and modernized it to, you need to fit in with us. You need to take every stripe of quote unquote difference that makes you feel like a threat to us and erase it so that we feel comfortable with you, right? Discomfort and unsafety. We don't know how to separate it. And so I want us to lean into the discomfort as nonprofit practitioners. I want us to recognize that it's not enough to put up art by Black people or art by Indigenous artists on our walls and not have services to come that Indigenous and Black folks and racialized folks coming in the door can access, right? It's not fine to tokenize your employees who are of racialized stripes, but not give them the resources to accomplish that work. And then penalize them for wanting to accomplish that work. The other thing that really sticks out to me, and I think it was mentioned earlier that I wanted to draw on, is that, you know, when we talk about gender, particularly men versus folks who experience gender marginalization, including women, including non-binary folks, and folks of other genders, we will often say that women and other gender marginalized folks are judged in a say in a hiring situation, they're judged based on their performance, and men are judged on their potential, right? And in the same way, I want to flip that to utilize an anti-racism lens. I want to articulate that I believe that, you know, we talked about intent and impact earlier. I think that white folks are afforded the benefit of good intention, and racialized folks are often offered the judgment of the impact that they might have in creating discomfort for white folks, right? And so how do we judge based on who folks are also creates a really dynamic barrier in the work of inclusion in our nonprofits.
Thank you, Roselle. We actually have received from the audience, from the participant. So I'm going to take the prerogative to direct the next question to Patti. And then there's one specific question for Tyson and one for Roselle, actually. So so this question is a bit long, but I'm going to read the question to you, Patti. So why do you think there has been, let me start again. How do you respond to pushback from individuals and organizations here from the dominant culture who benefit from current systems and processes when you try to actively prioritize equity-seeking groups or incorporate mechanisms, processes, and actions to address equity gaps? For example, when they don't believe those gaps or inequities exist, or when they make arguments around merit, quality, professionalism, and do not think identity should be considered or recognized, whether it is in hiring, funding, supporting, providing services. Would you like to take this one? Pushback.
Because I pretty much have that conversation a few times a week. It's one of the things that kind of Buddhism teaches you is to be in the moment, to be present in the moment. And so, you know, all we can ask of, all we can do is understand the time we are in. And again, to what Tim said earlier, do some deep reflection and thinking about what your organization does, what you are here to achieve. So in my world, I am here to ensure there's two things that I'm here to do. One is to encourage and foster systems that celebrate and accommodate and encourage a sustainable and resilient arts sector. And the second thing I'm here for is to contribute to building a city for all Calgarians, not some Calgarians, through arts-led city building or arts-led community building. Those are my two things. And within both of those, in this current context, what I believe this moment is asking of us is to ensure that when we talk about Calgarians, that we are talking about all Calgarians, not some. And if you look at my system, all you have to do is go back to 2017 in my annual report and see how many organizations that were white-led I funded. And go look at it now. And then to Teresa's point, we are the third most diverse city in Canada. 38% are visible minority. Go look at my granting list in 2017 and tell me that the investment of the public dollars that I am stewarding fully acknowledged that we are trying to build a community for all Calgarians, not some. That's my answer. You don't have to agree, and you sure as heck don't have to like it. And back to, you got to lean into that discomfort. This is the time in which we live. This is the time that I believe, this is what I believe this moment is asking of me and the organization that I lead. And you will have a different answer, but you need to be able to answer that question as it relates to inclusion, to unhindered plurality. That's my final thought.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your response and insight. And thank you. And reinforcing the need to critically reflect and examine. I think our personal and organizational assumptions and beliefs and values that might have been there for over 60, 70 years. So thank you for sharing your insights. So next, this one is addressed to Tyson, I'm sorry, Tyson, as well as others who wish to respond. So this is interesting because one of my backup question is on actually on governance, reflective boards, inclusive boards in the nonprofit, because there was an article released last week that talked to the pervasive underrepresentation of minorities on nonprofit boards. Now, this question, it was mentioned to Tyson first. It was mentioned that you are on the board of a cooperative. And so this participant wants to hear your thoughts or anyone else on the panel about the possibility of alternative nonprofit models, such as nonprofit cooperatives in promoting diversity and inclusion. Tyson?
Yeah, that's, so I wanted to actually just quickly briefly touch on a couple of things from the last question, Teresa, that you mentioned that will kind of answer, I think, the alternative to I think what I said, what Tim mentioned is like all systems sort of have to change, and at CommunityWise, a similar time frame around when Cada was doing it, but in 2016 they started to realize, the staff collective there, that the access to services were really being divided by racial lines. And that was really the impetus of why they decided to begin doing the anti-racist organizational change project. And I think, and I've been with them since 2016 in that process. And a couple of the barriers that I think we were initially challenged by, or didn't become barriers, was time. It does take time and commitment to really dedicate to that, but also relationships. There were hours and hours of that I think really compounded to help the group ground themselves in the work of what this means. So, for myself, it was these questions that were prompted to me about my own identity, or how I, went through this space of racism in a nonprofit to be able to think about, oh wow, here are all the various ways that I've either experienced or my organization has experienced as it relates to anti-racism. So that's from communications to funding to board leadership to hiring to marketing to all of the ways that an operation works. And I think what's really important is if is an organization is changing whether you know it or not, and an organizational change is happening. And so it's either going to create more barriers or you're going to then be actively engaged with it. And I think the two themes that come from what I've understood from CommunityWise experience is that it's ongoing and emergent. And that emergent process is where Black Leadership Alliance Council has now been formed to hold some of the great learnings that AROC has done and will move forward with under Black. And I think one of the ways that we wanted to start was I said we want to start off well. And there are a lot of limitations and barriers, once again, to the way that the system, the nonprofit model operates in. And so we want to be able to be as flexible as possible within that, and really ensures that also that compensation is looked at maybe differently, how people participate, ensuring that it's strengths-based. And one of the things as well as relates to boards, I think, is we often think, well, everyone has, we think of like roles being something really, concrete, like I'm the president, I'm the vice president, I'm this person. And because of the way that we systematically have organized ourselves, we think that's the only thing I can do. And really, it's the way of how it makes things easier, but we also sometimes let that limit ourselves into how people can participate. And I think, and just a really great example of sort of board leadership too is that I'm seeing is as representative of holding to this space as it relates to Black is I'm inquiring with different organizations, because as we start to dig down and we start to realize how emergent this process is, because CommunityWise isn't perfect at it, Cada is not perfect at it, CVO is not perfect at this. And as you start to dig deeper, like I said earlier, those nuances start to come up. And so a group that I'm actually looking to explore this with is we constantly say, well, we need to make room for people at the table. And the reality is sometimes people just actually have to leave the room and leave the table and have someone in that new role. And that actually takes sacrifice. It takes a whole entire attitude shift as to what that looks like. And so, but that's where, as you start to develop and understand this process of anti-racist org change, it really begins to start to question all of the ways that that we do things. And so, but it isn't just, well, we just need to hire more people. It becomes, what does that start to look like? And at AROC, we have it as an onion, as a metaphor. As you start to peel back all of the various layers, you start to sort of question, what is that for me personally? And so I have someone that I'm sort of just, initially it was, well, we want race audits, we want this, we want that. And I was like, I'm just interested in actually seeing, what does it look like for this one experience that you're maybe mentioning to me about stepping down, essentially? What does it look like? Because the room is not going to get any bigger. There isn't the money for that. There isn't the capacity for it. So what does that actually look like? And I'm interested in exploring those things as it relates to organizational change, because that's where the interesting stories come into, and also the marginalized folks can be able to also step into that as well to edify that story. And so I don't know if I really answered the question, but what I think is that the board piece really begins to, that's where the power is also created as well. And so, to get there though, I think it is also unpeeling back all of the various layers that are covering that. And so, it does, but it starts to have emergent themes come throughout, and that might be a particular individual, a particular way of doing things that an organization does, that starts to become in question, and it does require a lot of sacrifice, I think, from and I think specifically from those who are white within that organization.
Well, thank you, Tyson, for reinforcing the importance of change. Change, is in a way is the constant. Change is growth, and change is being responsive and meeting up your mission and mandate. And change is actually part of personal development. I think that I think you also raised that point. And then also when we look at systemic change, it is about program service delivery, it is about human resources, it's about policies and all of that. And also it have to include governance, where part of the organizational power relies, where the organizational direction is actually set, and to a certain extent where approval of allocation of resources. So thank you for touching on those points. I'm going to combine the last two questions and first have Roselle respond. I know that we have very limited time. I'm going to give this a try, Roselle, or you really feel the urge to respond. So how do you think, okay, so I think I'll start with this one. Can you please speak more to how the term people of color can be problematic and why racialized is more inclusive word? And also the other is the evolution to adding power differential to the definition of racism, where terms like sexism and ageism have remained more open to a broader definition. Your challenge to answer in 2 minutes.
Okay. I don't know if I would say challenge accepted, because that implies I'm going to do it. But what I will say to the first part of that question is language is always evolving, and language is limited, and it reflects our current understandings of how we see the world. So we use language. Thought comes before language, but we use language as our best tool to express thought, right? And so what I will say about the evolution of the use of people of color versus racialized is that the term people of color implies that there are some people who have color and some people that do not. And I think that this invisibilizes the construct of race as having an impact on the lives of everyone. Race has an impact on the lives of people who benefit from it and on the lives of people who experience marginalization because of it. And I think that one of the points of privilege when you experience race as whiteness is that you don't have to think about the ways in which your race is neutral or the ways in which your race shapes and benefits your lived experiences. So that's one of the benefits, that's one of the privileges of your race, is that you don't have to think about it. Every single one of the rest of us do. I walk into a room and I immediately count the number of racialized folks that I see, right? I think that most of us do that. And I don't think that most white people do that. And that is because we're coding for safety, we're coding for community, we're coding for, okay, who are the people here who are like me, right? And so I want you to consider terms that perhaps center the privileged or dominant group. So people of color is one. I'm conscious of time, Teresa, I see you looking at the clock. The other, I will say to you that those systems, all of them, sexism, racism, are all structures of power. So there can be discrimination towards men, but men cannot experience the type of sexism and misogyny that folks who experience gender marginalization do. So that includes women, non-binary folks, and other genders, right? So all systems have power attached to how we understand them. And all people who experience an underrepresentation of power within those systems experience exponentially higher rates of oppression, marginalization, violence, both systemic and otherwise. And so I invite you to consider how all of our relations experience power dynamics within them, because it will tilt the way that you consider how we build, everything from programs and governance to how we actually consider one another and speak to and hold space for one another. Ooh, under time.
Thank you, Roselle. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your input and contribution and cooperation. I am close, Karen, so it's been a privilege, and it actually to be on this to be part of this today's event. I'm truly energized and privileged to be part of this. And I know that we are short of time. Happy New Year. Today is actually happy birthday to everyone. It's the 7th day of Chinese New Year. It's everybody's birthday. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Teresa, for leading today's conversation, and to the panelists for such a rich session. I appreciate you taking time to join us today and share your wisdom, and I look forward to continuing to learn and grow as we, as Tyson so eloquently said, dig deeper into what's next. I know I'll be thinking a lot about the notion of unhindered plurality and what that means for CCVO. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to continue your learning journey, we invite you to join us again next week for a webinar presented by the amazing Anila Li Yuen, President and CEO of the Center for Newcomers, who will be sharing how to identify and address systemic issues within your practice and your organization that lead to inequity within our sector. Also, please save the date for our next nonprofit at 2, April 8th, where we will be discussing the pandemic 1 year in. Who's been served, who's been left out, and how can we build back better? Thank you to ATB for supporting the presentation of our Nonprofit at 2 series, and to our supporters, the Motart Foundation, PwC Canada, and our media partner, Post Media. Thank you again to everyone who attended, our panelists, our supporters, the CCVO staff who worked very hard to put this event together. Please take a moment to complete the survey that you'll see pop up after the meeting ends. And in case you don't get a chance to share your feedback today, we'll also include the survey and some links to assist you to continue in your learning journey in a follow-up. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Happy birthday to everyone, and I hope you can join us again soon. Thank you.